He was true to his word, because we went out for dinner and we started talking about what those resources might be. And obviously, we were at this stage where U.S. military personnel had been found on foreign soil, and that meant they're going home. That's the position of the American military. And the mayor of Fort Erie was overjoyed to hear this, because it meant he probably didn't have to pay for it. And what began was at the beginning an almost humorous, well, it was humorous, effort on our part to get the Canadian military into action. Because these guys had come over in full military uniform, occupied the mayor's office, which was, in our opinion, the second invasion of Canada. And they basically offered that they would fly in military tents in their U.S. helicopters the next day. And we'd have tents set up and security personnel, anything we wanted. And I don't know, I was 25 years younger, I don't know what happened, but I just said to myself, that's probably not a good thing from a Canadian military perspective. So I said, give me a few hours, I'm going to phone the Canadian military and see if they can do that, and you guys can work together. So I phoned the Lincoln and Welland militia. And I said to them, got a situation here, I need some tents set up. And the guy literally on the other end line said, sure, no problem, I'll phone Downsview, I think we can have them to you by the end of next month. And I went, well, who are you going to call in Downsview? And he gave me this guy's name, Colonel Prosser. And I said, okay, I'm going to call Colonel Prosser if you don't mind. I'm going to explain a kind of a dicey situation. So I phoned Colonel Prosser, got his assistant, of course, and explained that the U.S. Army were going to fly in tents the next morning. And I got a call back about an hour later in the mayor's office, and they said, no problem, we'll have them there tomorrow. So that was the beginning of the Canadian military response to a situation where it was absolutely clear that the American military could do anything that you needed them to do. And what they ended up doing actually was providing just amazing expertise out of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. They had photographers, forensic photographers, they had physical anthropologists, they had folks who were just happy to come out and help with the excavation. But probably the most important person at all was one of the two colonels who showed up in the first place, and his name was Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitehorn. And he was actually the historian to the U.S. Secretary of the Army. So this guy, like, he owns the U.S. Archives, right? So he knows exactly what he's got to go and find to figure this one out. Because we're all operating in the dark here. We don't really understand much about who these folks might be. But it gave a push to the town and confidence that somebody was going to pay the bill, and the town got behind it, the Canadian military got behind it, and by the second week in November, we had tents, lighting, propane heaters. We had moved the full-time crew in. We had help from the Smithsonian. We had help from the National Museum. And we were beginning to fully investigate every one of these graves that we had begun to find with unparalleled support. So here we are, just brushing off one of the bodies. The pedestal's been established. Here's a couple of more that have been established. And the crew is working within these tents. It was actually quite a pleasant environment. And we ended up with rows of exposed burials inside these tents. And there were two main tents, but you can see here they had been laid out very much in a cemetery fashion, as were these. But if you look carefully at this one, that's actually one grave. So we knew also that people were dying in numbers and that they were burying them in numbers. So we knew that there was a story behind that as we were discovering it. We also realized that we had varying conditions that we had to have help with, both the artifacts and the bone. In this case, Julia and Anna McLaughlin from the Royal Ontario Museum had to put a number of the bones in plaster because the consistency of the bone was like wet graham cracker. In that particular area, it was immediately adjacent to a septic system of a cottage that had been over these burials for probably 40 years. And Charlotte here is working on one of the burials on metal, pieces of metal that were very degraded, that we were very worried about saving the information off them. So we had her come from the Canadian Conservation Institute and save these things and conserve them for our effort, which would be coming in the months ahead to figure out who all these people were. Now, because it was a US military site, it was absolutely clear, we ended up with all sorts of visitors. This is the famous Miss Moneypenny from the early Sean Connery films. She was, by this time, she was a reporter of some sort, or a columnist, I think, at the Toronto Sun. And she just decided that, you know, she was important enough that she should get into this dig. And she showed up one day and went, well, of course, you're Miss Moneypenny, we'll let you. So we toured her through, I forget, I think she went through the mayor's office. But this was a particularly interesting day when a helicopter landed in Buffalo with the US Secretary General of the Army and a contingent of about a dozen people. And they came, and this is Colonel Prosser here. So they were, and I'm in this group too, giving General Becker a pretty clear kind of tour of this place and explaining what we were finding. Still early in the game, still without all the answers, but he was a really fascinating, intelligent guy with a medical background, so he was absolutely engaged in what he was looking at, trying to figure out what we were finding. One of my favorite visitors was Candy. Candy was a black lab that had just been trained by what became an absolutely famous project in the US. This Bill Tohurst was training labs to find dead bodies in the 80s. And for some of you who might read Kathy Reich's novels, there was one novel in which she explored this and actually mentioned Tohurst. And this was the first one, and he spotted this happening, and he called me direct and said, I really want to know whether these dogs can find ancient grave sites. And the dog was spot on. It found places where we had removed the bone, and it found places where we subsequently found bone. And you know, when asked what that's about, I had done a little bit of chemistry on grave sites in the late 70s and early 80s, and grave sites have high values in nitrogen and phosphorus, and if it's at all possible that the dogs were signaling on that, I don't know, but that is a possibility of what and how the dogs were finding these graves. This got to be a real problem because of Harry. Once he broke the news, everybody, because it was US military on Canadian soil, everybody thought this was the greatest story since sliced bread. And we were getting interrupted all the time, and so we organized weekly press conferences. And Irv Weinstein, anybody remember Irv Weinstein? The guy with no neck? And Irv had, every night on the nightly news for those 2 months, he had the big dig. That's what it was, and he'd do an update. They're up to 18, you know, and what had happened that particular week, because we did it weekly, but they had some angle. They had a reporter that was on it all the time, had some angle, and every night there was some story on the big dig. So we did have to feed them, and there was serious, very serious media there as well. We ended up working with the New York Times. We worked with Washington Post, with Dan Bjarnason was there from the CBC doing something for the National. I mean, it was a big deal. And we ended up with this kind of setup. There was a former cottage here, and there was a series of kind of burials here, and there was a cluster of burials here. That's the George house here. That's the septic tank I was telling you about. There was actually an ox buried over here, and Snake Hill was right there. So these are bodies that are placed right beside the former location of Snake Hill. Now, This is burial 4. I'm going to go through some of the burials just to give you an idea of what these were like. But I have another message to give you when I do this, which I'll do as I describe them. This individual had probably the most complete uniform of all of the bodies at the site, of all of the graves at the site. And you can see here there are these 4-hole buttons, which are overall buttons that held the pants up. And this row of buttons right here are script-eye buttons that went around on the roundabout. So if you'll remember the opening image in color, that's a roundabout. That's what this guy's wearing. He's got an American military uniform on, and he's buried with it. But there were clues. He was also one of 2 guys that was in a coffin. So only 2 of them were in coffins. You might ask, well, why is that? And that's because there were camp followers, families, and if they were there when their loved one died, they might be able to get a coffin together and bury the person in a coffin, and only twice out of the 28 bodies did we find coffins. And of course, this was one of the first buttons we found. It's also an overall button, but as I often say to crowds when I'm talking about this, it's not rocket science to figure out the nationality of this guy, right? With a big US sitting right on it. Burial 5 led us to another conclusion about the site. It was literally this burial that led us to a very important conclusion. So you're looking at him on his back, extended. Obviously, the whole Aboriginal thing had been abandoned. We realized these were American soldiers. But we really didn't know yet the context of the burial site. And so here's the guy, close up of his torso, his kind of chest area. And here's his right hand here. And right there, that's his left hand. And that's his third hand. So it was this burial, the minute we saw that, we went, what's going on here? And that's what's going on. They had dug the grave, and they had placed an amputated hand in the grave before they put the body in the grave. And so that sent Colonel Whitehorn off in a slightly different direction in the archives to figure out where all the camp hospitals were, where the surgery was being done, and given the location, what might be happening here. And of course, we were absolutely fascinated because this literally was the first physical evidence of amputation. I mean, we obviously knew amputation occurred all through the war, but it was the first physical remains of amputation in the War of 1812 anywhere. So it caught the attention of anybody who had any interest in kind of this realm of the War of 1812. We had all sorts of folks come and want to play a role in figuring this out. So this particular person had taken a shot here. And I'll say this more than once tonight, but if you've got a very complex wound right here, the easiest way to deal with it in American military medicine of the period is to render that simple by amputating here. You render a complex wound simple through amputation. That's what they said. That's what the textbook said. And here is a period surgical kit with the scalpels to put in the initial cut, and then to cut through the skin, etc., and then the saw. And here's one of the tibiae from the site that was found. And you can see the saw marks right on the bone, and then the snap mark, because folks are in a hurry in the War of 1812, constant bombardment, so you cut through and snap, and that's the snap mark. Same way you're doing it when you're doing bone. If we look carefully enough, you'll see the nick marks from the scalpel in the bone above the cut. It's absolutely fascinating look at amputation, at medical intervention, at medical surgery during the war. Now, Burial 5 had a few other surprises for us as well. One was a large iron shot under his right scapula, which had been lodged in the body, obviously. It had not perforated that scapula, but it was in the body next to the scapula. And he had a completely fractured left arm, but he also had a brick fragment lodged into his vertebrae. So that brick fragment was not part of the soil context. That's part of what entered him. So he probably was somewhere down near the main fort and was brought back to this area, subject to explosion down near the fort, brought back to this area and ended up in this grave along with the third hand. Many military buttons found at the site. So those are overall buttons. It actually, lots of folks, they weren't absolutely sure those were American, but they're pewter and they're 4-hole and they're American buttons. There are some officers' buttons found, but only in the medical waste pits. We found other medical waste pits. We found Regiment of Artillery buttons. We found militia buttons. There's that US one. Here's the common script I. But we did find a few British buttons as well. And here's a 104th foot button right here out of Burial 6, found in the guy's pocket. So he'd picked one up. And this one came out of a surgical medical waste pit. And that's a Royal Artillery button. That's a British button. So we're fairly confident that during September, during sorties from the fort to attack the British lines, they brought at one point back 300 British prisoners, and they definitely would have been worked on as well. And very likely that's how these British buttons get into the mix in these medical waste pits. There were other things in these burials, including flints. These are the big pocket areas where you'll find personal effects right here, along with an obvious series of buttons. There's the flint, and for any of you who know anything about flints of the period, that's a honey-colored French-supplied Napoleonic flint, and that's what the Americans were using. And then there's this big, lovely kind of brass piece. That's actually the piece that Charlotte was working on earlier, and the one that you saw in the previous slide that was the militia. We think this guy had a big militia cloak on over whatever it was that contained that. Burial 10 had, you can see, very interesting objects in this guy's pockets, including his personal spoon. And these guys would hang on to their own spoons, and often they'd have the initials carved into the back of them. This one did not. But he also had what's a T-shaped musket tool, which is for cleaning out the musket of debris, and he had a couple of flints. The colors off on this slide, those are actually honey-colored flints. So those are American musket tools in his one pocket, his personal spoon in the other, and he's been sent to his maker in that situation. This was our first burial that was a multiple burial. They got to be known in the local media as the Three Lads, only because it was an endearing term we started to use. And each of them had a very interesting story to tell. Burial 12 had a Y-shaped tool and a feather primer. You can see here. And we think that's a British musket tool. We think he picked that up because he was in a military uniform, a U.S. military uniform. We think he picked that up and was carrying it as well. Burial 13, here's his right leg, his femur, right here. That's his lower leg. That's all that's left of his upper leg. There's a close-up. A couple small fragments and that. So he basically has taken a shot right through here that's basically disintegrated the leg, femoral artery. He bled out like that.